These are the slides for week 5 covering the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system. So these are two organ systems that are very closely linked together in terms of their function. And we're going to talk about kind of structural overlap between the two of them as well. Before we get into the content for today, I wanted to address a couple things. First, I went through and responded to your reflections for weeks 3 and 4, so please make sure you go through and read my feedback for those. If I gave you suggestions for studying tips, please make sure you kind of read through that and take it to heart. I noticed that the scores did improve for the last quiz, so I see that you got my communication about that. Please make sure you're continuing to watch the lecture videos and use the study guides because I really try to be transparent about what's going to be on the quizzes. In terms of watching the lectures, I know that some of you are a bit daunted by the fact that the one lecture that's posted a week is an hour long. And I acknowledge that it can be a lot to just sit down and watch it for an hour. The cool thing about online classes is you don't have to. You can watch 15 minutes and then pause it. You can have it running in the background as you're cleaning or taking care of your child or running errands or whatever. The fact that they're captioned through YouTube also helps. You don't have to actually have the sound on and listen to my voice. You can just kind of watch it and read through the captions if you'd like to. However helps you get this course material. I spend a lot of time making these slides and trying to make them exactly what you need to know for the lecture portion of this class, also to support lab and to prepare you for future courses and the learning objectives. So please make sure you're taking advantage of that. There's a lot of helpful information here that puts the slides into context. Any way you can find to make sure that you're adhering to that and watching the lectures and engaging with that, I really encourage you to do. So in terms of kind of building on previous material from previous weeks, remember that we've talked quite a bit about cell signaling and cell connections, as well as tissue and tissue characteristics. Those were a big component of Reflection 3, and we've continued to kind of build on those themes. Last week, we also talked about types of blood cells, which were more than just the red blood cells that we talk about being synthesized in red bone marrow. So kind of continuing in that theme, we'll talk about very specific types of blood cells. Although we won't go into a huge level of detail, there's a lot of, especially white blood cells. You might come across kind of some of the different terms for that. We're going to keep it kind of surface level today and then build on it as we talk about maybe the immune system or other types of systems. And we're also going to be continuing building on ideas of cardiac and smooth muscle. Last week when we talked about the musculoskeletal system, we really focused on skeletal muscle, but today we're going to be talking more about cardiac and smooth. So for some of you, it may be readily apparent how the respiratory system and circulatory system fit together. They're physically very closely linked and structurally and functionally linked as well. But in terms of that function, the respiratory system is responsible for gas exchange between the our surroundings or environment and the inside of our body. So that's a point of gas exchange. But then to actually get that gas into our tissues and to remove other gases from those tissues, we need the circulatory system. So in us, the circulatory system and the respiratory system are very closely linked. We see that they're interfaced, they interact in some way because our circulatory system carries respiratory gases. It carries oxygen and carbon dioxide. It facilitates gas exchange between the respiratory system and our body tissue. So not just tissue in the lungs, but tissue in your feet and all throughout your body. So that's important. We have the respiratory system going from the environment to our body, and then the circulatory system going from that first part of our body to the rest of our body, and then bringing it back out so that gases can leave back into the environment. Okay, so I'm going to start out by talking about the respiratory system. We'll start out by talking about different systems of gas exchange because our system of gas exchange is quite different from other organisms. We'll talk about how gas exchange actually happens within our respiratory surface So thinking about ideas that we've talked about already, like diffusion, surface area, and other definitions that we'll get into. We'll talk about the role of specific skeletal muscles in breathing, and then also this idea of pressure changes. And then we'll talk about how gases are transported in bodily fluids, specifically in blood, thinking about the role of hemoglobin and differences in how blood carries oxygen and carbon dioxide. So again, these slides are very important. I know a lot of you had questions recently about the textbook. The textbook is free, it's helpful, it has great information. It also has a lot of information for some sections. So I would not encourage you to just sit down and read the textbook. That is not an impactful use of your time. I would encourage you to go through the slides, to watch the lecture, to pay attention to these slides specifically about what sections are covered so that you don't end up reading the whole chapter if you don't need to, and you don't end up kind of getting bogged down in details that you don't need to worry about. All right, so in terms of gas exchange, life originated aquatically, which is great because the ocean is full of water that has dissolved gases in it. So if you are a very flat, squishy creature in the ocean and you don't have many layers of tissue, it's very easy to use simple diffusion to bring oxygen into your body and carbon dioxide out. So even if you have some level of tissue development, a lot of organisms in the ocean have these open cavities where they can draw oxygen and food in and then send carbon dioxide and waste products out. So that's what's going on with a sponge. So aquatic organisms use direct or simple diffusion to get oxygen and give away carbon dioxide. It's a passive process. It's just kind of happening with the flow of water. So here we have a central cavity. Water travels into that cavity, bringing in oxygen. It removes carbon dioxide that's produced as a waste product from cellular respiration. We'll talk about that later in the semester. And so it's having this respiratory gas exchange taking place. I want to pause here and bring up that word respiratory. So oxygen is used in cellular respiration, which is a series of processes to kind of break apart and metabolize carbon and give us a ready supply of ATP. So it's how our cells get energy. Respiration happens in our cells to give us energy. It uses oxygen and it gives off carbon dioxide. Often when we think about respiration, we think about our respiratory system. We think about breathing in oxygen into our lungs and breathing out carbon dioxide from our lungs. So just keep in mind that our respiratory system is a system in place to facilitate those respiratory processes that are happening in our cells, so cellular respiration. So it's kind of a macro-micro relationship. So one thing to pay attention to with this sponge is that it is a single layer of cells. So it's really easy for it to kind of draw this water in, have gas exchange, have that gas exchange happen with all of its cells, and then send that water out. But things get a little bit more complex as you get more and more layers of cells and tissue. So if we look at other aquatic organisms, like a fish, you start to see the need for circulatory systems. You can't just have water flowing in and reaching all of the tissue. You have to have exchange happening with some fluid within that tissue in order to circulate stuff around. So we need kind of respiratory systems and circulatory systems. This is where it gets kind of nebulous because some organisms have completely separate respiratory and circulatory systems, which we'll see in just a moment. For us, there's going to be a lot of overlap in talking about the two because, again, they're closely linked. So fish have gills, and that's their surface of exchange. They have capillaries, they have blood vessels going into those gills. Gas exchange happens at those gills, and then the blood flows throughout the rest of the body. So when we're looking at human blood, there are respiratory gases that are carried by our blood, specifically in hemoglobin for oxygen. But there's a lot of other stuff too. So remember that blood is a type of connective tissue. So it has this plasma component as well as cellular elements. We'll revisit that idea in a little bit. It's got tons of stuff in it. It's got water, ions, proteins, waste products, different nutrients like from digestion. It's got white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets. It's got a ton of stuff that's not respiratory gases. So note that most of the content of blood is not actually the oxygen and carbon dioxide that we usually talk about. We always talk about blood being oxygenated or deoxygenated, and for us that is a very valid way to characterize it, but for a lot of other organisms that's not actually the case. So they have other stuff that carries all the non-respiratory components of blood. So what insects have is a tracheal system. You might have heard of the trachea, which is an important component of our respiratory system. So this is kind of like if we have our respiratory system and we kind of stretch it out throughout the entire insect. So they have these spiracles, which are openings on the outside of their body, kind of like our nostrils. That's where gas exchange happens with the surrounding environment. Gases flow into the tracheal system, and then the tracheal system is a series of tubes that gets narrower and narrower, and gas exchange happens with tissue directly from the tracheal system. Insects have a completely separate respiratory system. It's called an completely separate circulatory system. It's called an open circulatory system, and it's basically like having their blood sloshing throughout their entire body. So we are full of blood, but all of our blood is contained within vessels, which we'll talk about later in this in the next chapter. For insects, they have just this blood floating around, and it's called hemolymph. So hemo like blood, lymph like you might think about lymphatic tissue or lymphatic fluid if you're familiar with that term. So it's basically blood but without the respiratory gases. And they do have a heart, but the heart is kind of more like a immersion blender. It's kind of like making pancakes. You just kind of stick the blender in and it sloshes stuff around. They do have sinuses that kind of help move stuff through, but it's not like having a pump hooked up to hoses like our system is. So you can see that tracheal system here. It really is like our trachea and like our bronchioles, kind of getting smaller and smaller and facilitating gas exchange. So this ties back to the idea that we talked about when we were talking about cell size, thinking about surface area to volume ratio. When gas initially enters a spiracle and goes into the trachea, you have very high volume and very low surface area in relation to that. But as you get into these smaller silvery tracheal tubes, you have much higher surface area to volume ratio and a lot of surface for gas exchange to take place. When we talk about different vessels in our body, we'll talk about capillaries, and so that's where that high surface area to volume ratio comes into play for us. So while in insects, gas exchange with the environment happens in the spiracles, in humans, that gas exchange is happening at our nose and mouth. So we're taking in oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide through those openings. This GIF is kind of cool because it's showing that airflow. But one thing that I want to kind of push back on is this idea that we're just taking in oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide. That's kind of what we think about, and when we get quantitative about it, that's what the crux of it is going to be. But we are absolutely not taking in pure oxygen or releasing pure carbon dioxide. They're mixtures of gases, and actually we only use about less than 20% of the oxygen that we breathe in. That's why something like mouth-to-mouth actually works when you're trying to resuscitate someone. In old CPR recommendations, you are still breathing into them about 80% of the oxygen that you breathed in. So you're not giving them mostly carbon dioxide by any means. Even though over time it might not be beneficial, it's enough to kind of get them going again. So you can see here that our tracheal system looks very similar to the cricket tracheal system, except that it's going to interface and exchange with our circulatory system, whereas in insects, it just kind of gets smaller and smaller again until gas exchange happens directly with the respiratory system. So for us, we have this upper respiratory tract, which is kind of our nose, our mouth, our larynx, part of our trachea, and then getting into our lower respiratory tract with the bronchi, bronchioles, and then our lungs, and as well as the alveoli, which I'll mention in just a moment, that are not labeled on this picture. So if you've ever heard of laryngitis, that's referring to swelling around your larynx. Bronchitis is referring to swelling or inflammation of your bronchioles and your bronchi. So that kind of puts those words into context. So the gas exchange happens at your nose and mouth. Gas travels along this system to get into your lungs, where gas exchange with the rest of your body through the circulatory system occurs. So this GIF is kind of cool. It's showing you kind of the flow of air and the movement of your lungs going from your trachea to your bronchi, bronchioles. And then it's going to zoom in and show those alveoli, which are these sacs of air at the terminal ends of the bronchioles. They are surrounded by capillaries, which are very important blood vessels. There's a very high surface area to volume ratio. And so those alveoli are going to give oxygen to the blood and pull away carbon dioxide. So like I just mentioned, that gas exchange is actually happening in the lower respiratory tract at the alveoli. Here you can see those alveolar sacs that are completely surrounded in capillaries. One other thing that you can notice here is the relationship between the respiratory system and the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a muscle that expands between your thoracic and abdominal cavities and is very important for breathing. Another thing that you'll notice here is, first, anatomical positioning. Remember that our right side is the diagram's left side. That's why when we're looking at this, what appears to be the right side says left lung. You'll notice that the left lung has two lobes, an upper lobe and a lower lobe, while the right lung has an upper, middle, and lower lobe. So the right lung actually has more lobes. It's different in appearance. It's not perfectly symmetrical with the left lung. The reason for that is because the left side of your body, specifically in the thoracic cavity, houses your heart, and that is really close by to your lungs. So there's actually something called the cardiac notch on your left lung, which is where the heart sits. And so there's a different number of lobes between the two. So when we're thinking about gas exchange, there's a couple of things that we have to keep in mind. One is the idea of surface area. I mentioned surface area to volume ratio a few slides ago. In each lung, we have about 300 million alveoli and 75 meters squared of surface area. So that's a ton of space. Obviously, it's kind of condensed and wrapped around those air sacs, but that's really important for diffusion to occur. And remember that diffusion is a passive process, that oxygen and carbon dioxide are moving along their own concentration gradients. So when we think about concentration gradients, we have to start getting kind of quantitative about this process. So you might have heard the term partial pressure, and I wanted to take a moment to define that. So when we breathe in, gases come into our body, circulate, and then we breathe them out, and that's, like I mentioned, a mixture of gases. It's not purely oxygen that we're breathing in. We're not breathing out pure carbon dioxide. And each of those gases is moving along their own concentration gradient. So we have to start thinking about each of those gases in turn. So what partial pressure is a mixture of a measure of the concentration of each individual gas. So the partial pressure of oxygen, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within that mixture of gases. And we get that term partial pressure because when a gas is inside of a chamber, like our lungs or our circulatory system, it's kind of moving around and it's exerting a pressure on that container. So we measure the partial pressure of each individual gas in turn. So for example, here we have a couple of different blood vessels, the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vein. I will talk about those more in the circulatory system. We have the alveolus of the lungs, and then we have surrounding tissue. So we can see, for example, when we breathe in air, the partial pressure of oxygen is 160, When we breathe it out, the partial pressure is 120. So it's kind of decreased in concentration, but not that much, like I mentioned earlier. So when we breathe it in, the partial pressure of oxygen is 160. In the alveolus, it drops to 105, and then it's going to drop still further as it moves throughout our body, and exchange happens, and it's given to body tissue. So like I just mentioned, as gases move throughout the body, as they circulate in our circulatory system, their partial pressures are going to change and concentration gradients are established. Those concentration gradients drive gas exchange at alveoli and then also at body tissues. So another metric that's important is the actual volume of your lung. So lung volume measures the amount of air that is inhaled or exhaled. So the amount of air you can actually breathe in or exhale, and those are what we call functions. So obviously elephants have a very large lung volume relative to cheetahs, but cheetahs have evolved what we call a very high lung capacity. So lung capacity is any 2 or more volumes. It's a little bit different and it's more determined by genetics, physiology, sex, size, and different constraints. So just know the definitions of those two. When you go on to physiology, those will become more important. You don't need to stress about them too much right now. So as we've kind of seen already, there's a lot of different ways to breathe. We have humans. We didn't really get into birds, but we talked about grasshoppers, crickets, insects. We also briefly talked about aquatic animals. So there's a lot of different ways that this is accomplished. But for us, the flow of gases throughout our body is really dependent on our circulatory system. And so when gas first enters the body, we also need our muscles in order to kind of deal with the pressures that are involved and really draw those gases in and then also facilitate gas exchange out. So here, a couple of skeletal muscles that are very important are the diaphragm on the left, highlighted in green. You're probably familiar with that in the context of like hiccups. And then the intercostal muscles, which are on the right side, also highlighted in green. Those are muscles that are between your ribs. And so these are really important because they change the volume of your thoracic cavity, that upper chest region of your body. Before we talk more about the mechanics, though, I wanted to highlight something about the intercostal muscles. So a lot of people have what's called precordial catch syndrome, but don't really know what that is. So we're looking at the intercostal muscles here. If we kind of zoom in, we see that our ribs articulate or attach to our spinal cord, or spinal column, those vertebrae in the back of our body or the posterior portion. In the anterior portion or front of our body, our ribs articulate with our sternum or breastbone. And so if you look there, you can kind of see in between those are the intercostal muscles and what's called the intercostal nerve. So what precordial catch syndrome actually is it's sometimes you get that really sharp, stabby feeling in your chest, and it's like, am I dying? What's happening? And it really hurts to breathe. So it feels worse when you breathe, but then as you slowly take deep breaths in and out and move around very slowly, it goes away. So it's something that a lot of perfectly healthy people get that just feels like death, but what it actually might be is irritation of the intercostal nerve. So people aren't really sure what causes it. We all get it. You're not dying probably, but it's just something to be aware of. Okay, so in thinking about those muscles, remember that as they move, as they contract and then relax, they're changing pressure within the thoracic cavity by changing the volume. So volume and pressure are inversely related. As volume increases, pressure decreases. As volume decreases, pressure increases. So when you inhale, you are increasing the volume of the lungs. So you're moving that diaphragm down, you're moving those intercostal muscles out, you're contracting them, and that's decreasing the pressure of the thoracic cavity. It's making it more negative, and so air is going to flow from where it's more positive to where it's more negative, so air is going to get drawn in. So that is a very active process because you have to contract those muscles, but then when you relax them, when you exhale, your muscles relax, you decrease the volume of that thoracic cavity, it becomes more positive, and that increases, so your pressure is increasing, and then air is going to flow out. So because this is just the relaxation of muscles, it's a passive process. And so just another thing to keep in mind, exhalation is also called expiration. So when we're thinking about how oxygen actually makes its way through the circulatory system after gas exchange has taken place, that's being done with hemoglobin. So you've probably heard about hemoglobin before. It's shortened to HB, but you might not be familiar with what it actually is. So if we look at that word hemoglobin, it ends in IN, and words that end in 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 biology are proteins. So hemoglobin is first and foremost a protein, and it's housed in our red blood cells. I'm going to switch slides and kind of go through a label diagram of the structure of hemoglobin. So here we have the hemoglobin protein on the left, and what's called the heme molecule on the right. So hemoglobin is 4 chains of the globin protein. So it's actually 4 kind of subunits of protein put together. So you can see chain 1, chain 2 for beta, and then chain 1, chain 2 for alpha below. So there's 4 separate kind of proteins within this structure, and each of those has what's called a heme molecule on it. So heme is a pigment, it's red, and it has an iron ion in the center of it. So each heme pigment within the hemoglobin protein can carry 1 oxygen molecule, and because there's 4 of them, it can carry 4 oxygen molecules overall. So within each red blood cell, you have about 300 million hemoglobin if it's a healthy red blood cell. So as long as you don't have a condition like sickle cell anemia or thalassemia, which lead to problems with hemoglobin. And so each red blood cell is then capable of carrying 1.2 billion oxygen molecules. So oftentimes we kind of draw very simple diagrams of blood carrying oxygen. Keep in mind there's 1.2 billion O2 molecules per red blood cell. Another thing to keep in mind is that there's a lot of misconceptions about oxygenated blood versus deoxygenated blood, specifically in arteries and veins. So one thing that I'm going to revisit when we talk about the circulatory system is that arteries do not always carry oxygenated blood and veins do not always carry deoxygenated blood. Arteries just move blood away from the heart and veins return it to the heart. Sometimes there's a correlation there with oxygenation, sometimes there's not. Another thing is that deoxygenated blood is not blue. A lot of people think that because their veins look blue, that when you remove the oxygen, you change the color of blood from red to blue. There is a slight color change here. Oxyhemoglobin is a very bright red color, and deoxyhemoglobin is kind of a darker red. But I had a teacher in 2nd grade one time who used a pin to cut open his vein, and he showed that because it goes from blue to red when it hits oxygen, he used that to kind of prove to us that deoxygenated blood is blue and oxygenated blood is red. And that's just not true. It's just the way that light refracts through our skin. So there's not actually that red-blue difference between oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood. So there's a few things that affect how well oxygen can bind to hemoglobin, which is called the oxygen carrying capacity of hemoglobin. One of those is the partial pressure of oxygen. So initially it's kind of hard for oxygen to bind to hemoglobin. As more oxygen binds, it gets a little bit easier to attach, but then once it gets really high, it gets harder to attach that final oxygen. So the partial pressure of oxygen kind of changes how well hemoglobin picks it up. Another thing that affects it is carbon dioxide levels. So it turns out carbon dioxide actually changes the chemistry of our blood. So it actually makes the pH lower. So both carbon dioxide levels and blood pH affect how well hemoglobin is able to pick up oxygen. And then different disease states like sickle cell anemia, which is pictured on the right, and thalassemia, which affects the quality of the hemoglobin and kind of the concentration as well. Those affect how well hemoglobin can bind to oxygen. So just to briefly review what sickle cell anemia actually is, some of you might have heard of it. So this is very common along the equator, and it's kind of a trade-off with protection against malaria. So malaria is a protozoan. That means it's a single-celled eukaryote, Plasmodium is a protozoan that causes malaria. And so it's a really serious disease. It causes death all over the world. And so sickle cell anemia changes the shape of your red blood cells, and it affects your hemoglobin. It changes the weight of the hemoglobin protein. And so it turns out that having 2 copies of this sickle cell anemia allele causes the sickle cell anemia disease, but having just 1 copy and 1 copy of the normal hemoglobin, which we call being a heterozygote, confers an advantage against malaria. So you're less likely to get malaria. You also are a carrier for sickle cell, which means that your children might have it, but you have less of the negative impact from sickle cell. So if we look at kind of a pedigree of that, so if you have 2 copies of the normal allele, your hemoglobin is totally healthy, but you don't have any protection against malaria. If you have just 1 copy of the sickle cell and 1 copy of the normal allele, then you have healthy blood cells and malaria protection. And if you have 2 copies of the sickle cell allele, then you have unhealthy blood cells. It can be a pretty serious and debilitating condition, but you do have protection against malaria. So this is not something you need to worry about for the next quiz. It is something that we'll review when we talk about genetics. So to kind of focus more on carbon dioxide now instead of oxygen, carbon dioxide is handled a little bit differently in our blood than oxygen. So it's not obligated to be bound to hemoglobin. So about 5 to 7% of it is just dissolved right into the blood plasma, the liquid portion of the blood. 10% is bound to hemoglobin, but the rest of it is part of what's called the bicarbonate buffer system. So it affects pH throughout our body. I forget whether I've talked to you guys about ocean acidification, but what that is this idea that carbon dioxide that affects kind of climate change also gets absorbed into the oceans. It mixes with water to form a weak acid, carbonic acid, and that changes the pH of the oceans. It also releases bicarbonate and hydrogen ion from that formation of carbonic acid. So carbon dioxide does something similar throughout our body. It affects pH. It's part of this bicarbonate buffer system. Okay, so that was the respiratory system. Now we're going to get into the circulatory system. We'll start by talking kind of broadly about different definitions of circuits within the circulatory system. We'll talk about what makes up blood, get into the structure of the heart and blood vessels, and then briefly talk about this idea of cardiac output, blood pressure, systole and diastole, which are things you'll talk more about in anatomy and physio. So remember, last week we talked about skeletal muscle. We've also briefly revisited that in the respiratory system. Today we're focusing more on cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. So cardiac muscle is found in the heart. Remember that it's structured kind of similarly to skeletal muscle in terms of striation. There's some differences in terms of the cellular components, but the connections between the cells really matter. So there's what we call these intercalated discs between cells. There's also gap junctions, which allow the flow of electrochemical signals, and desmosomes. So when we look at this GIF of a beating heart, there's 2 things at play here. One is that the heart has to coordinate that beating. It has to send an action potential. It has to propagate this electrochemical signal throughout itself. And so it has to exchange ions through those gap junctions. So you have this coordination of function. And then when that happens, it can't be like sitting at a stoplight where you have, one person kind of going, another person lagging, another person going. It has to be this coordinated movement. Otherwise, the muscle would just rip apart. And so the desmosomes anchor that muscle together. So they hold it together and allow this flexible movement. Another thing to keep in mind is that cardiac muscle, heart muscle, makes up the bulk of the heart. So there's a lot of muscle at play there. We're going to talk about different layers of the heart, so keep that in mind. Okay, so when we're thinking about a circulatory system and why we even need it, remember that we have many layers of tissue. So we have to get stuff from the outside into that tissue. We need to get stuff from one part of the body to the other. And so we need a circulatory system to move stuff through our body. So in humans, we do not have an open circulatory system with hemolymph like insects do. We have a closed circulatory system. All of our blood is contained within vessels that are hooked up to a pump. So again, even though we think about being full of blood, it's always contained within vessels. If those vessels break, especially the small ones, then you get a bruise. So it's not an ideal situation. So we actually have two different circuits within our human circulatory system. We have the systemic circuit, so that's going through our body's system. It's circulating through our system, and it's taking oxygenated blood from the heart to the body, exchanging with body tissues, and then taking deoxygenated blood from the body back to the heart. So we have a loop there. We also have the pulmonary circuit. So if you speak Spanish, you might know the word pulmón for lung. So pulmonary should make you think about lungs. You might also think about pulmonary edema, which is fluid in the lungs. Pulmonary means lung. So the pulmonary circuit is taking deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs, having gas exchange with the surrounding environment, and then returning oxygenated blood from the lung to the heart. So we have two circuits, two loops to our circulatory system. So remember, I verbally mentioned this earlier in the slides, but connective tissue has some ground matrix with cells distributed through it, and blood is a type of connective tissue. So in human blood, the ground matrix is the plasma. It's that 55% liquid portion. The formed elements or the cellular elements are the cells that are distributed throughout that ground matrix. There's another word, serum. What that actually is the plasma component without coagulation or clotting factors. So it's just the plasma portion with some proteins removed. Okay, so focusing on those formed elements, we have three main types of cells: the erythrocytes, the leukocytes, and the thrombocytes, or the platelets. I'll get into each of those in turn, but you can kind of see them diagrammed here. They look very different, and those differences in structure affect their function. In general, though, blood is very important for homeostasis, so it kind of helps regulate our pH, our temperature, osmotic pressure, kind of changes in blood flow, and the relative size of blood vessels allows us to bring blood from the core of our body to the surface and allow us to give off heat and kind of cool that way. Blood is also important for growth because it helps redistribute nutrients and hormones. It's important for waste removal. It's filtered through our kidneys. And it's also important for immunity. So specifically, white blood cells, or leukocytes, are important for getting rid of pathogens and identifying pathogens. And then clotting factors and platelets are important for kind of sealing openings and healing our body so that we don't get further infections. Okay, so I'm going to walk through each of these cellular components in turn, starting with erythrocytes, which is just a fancy way to say red blood cell. Another way that we shorten that is RBC. So if you ever see the term RBC, that's referring to red blood cells. So like we mentioned last week, there are stem cells in your red bone marrow. Those are responsible for differentiating into red blood cells. When you take physio and anatomy, you will learn the complex process by which that takes place, but for now, just know that it's coming from red bone marrow. So those erythrocytes are responsible for carrying oxygen and a fraction of the carbon dioxide, and they also carry nitrous oxide. So nitrous oxide is an important gas that is involved in vasodilation, or changes in the size of blood vessels. And it also is important for gas exchange because it's affecting the surface area to volume ratio. On the right side, if we look at this diagram, we see those red blood cells with hemoglobin in them traveling through a small blood vessel. So there's some unique stuff about red blood cells. They don't have a lot of cellular components that we usually think about, like a nucleus or mitochondria. So they can't make their own ATP through certain processes. They don't have an endoplasmic reticulum, so they can't synthesize proteins. And so a lot of the typical cell stuff that we think about, they really can't do. Most of their cytoplasm is dedicated to housing hemoglobin, and their structure is affected so that they can easily move through blood vessels. So they have very high surface area for gas exchange. They're biconcave, meaning that they kind of have this indentation on either side of their cell. And they also have a unique cytoskeleton that allows them to change structure and very easily move through those blood vessels. So another thing to keep in mind is that they have all these surface proteins and lipids, those glycoproteins and glycolipids that we talked about earlier in the term. And so those are how we get type A, type B, type AB, and type O blood types. We'll talk about this a lot more when we talk about genetics, and I think that you might have already covered this in lab or will be soon. Okay, so we also have leukocytes, which is a fancy way of saying white blood cell, or WBC. So depending on the type of cell, they have different lifespans. Some of them last a short period of time, some of them last a long period of time, like many years, and they have different differentiation pathways depending on what type of leukocyte we're discussing. In general, there's granulocytes and agranulocytes. They are named accordingly based on how they look under the microscope. So granulocytes have this kind of granulated or spotty appearance. Agranulocytes don't. So that's the main distinction between that naming convention. There's less of them in our blood than erythrocytes, but they're much larger. They're fully formed cells. They're complete. They have all those organelles like nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria, and they can actually, some of them can leave the bloodstream and interact with body tissue to help with pathogen defense. So kind of continue along those lines, I think I've shown you guys this GIF before. There's a white blood cell, a bunch of red blood cells and bacterium, and that white blood cell is going to follow a chemical gradient, and it's going to kind of move its cytoskeleton within its cell to chase that bacterium, connect with it, and eventually swallow it or engulf it. So that is one way in which white blood cells are responsible for protecting our body from pathogens. So we also have platelets. Another term for platelet is thrombocyte, which is kind of confusing because cyte means cell and platelets aren't actually cells. They are little pieces that break off from what's called a megakaryocyte. And so they're just little components of cytoplasm and membrane floating around in our blood, but they're very important for clotting. So along with proteins like fibrin, which are found in our bloodstream, they help kind of seal up openings on our blood vessels and help prevent future blood loss. They're stored in our spleen and then they kind of float around and go to where they're needed. Okay, so when we're thinking about the system itself, cardiovascular system, we see two main words there. We have cardio, which means heart, and we're going to focus on that first. So keep in mind that the circulatory system has a lot of muscle. We already talked about the structure of cardiac muscle. There's also a ton of smooth muscle running through arteries and veins that we'll talk about in a little bit. So I'm going to talk you through the different kind of chambers of the heart using something called the KITE diagram. We're going to keep building this up and transition into an anatomically correct heart model, and then I'm going to hook it up to some important blood vessels. So the KITE diagram, I think, is helpful. It's not anatomically perfect, and when you are in lab, you're going to have to be able to identify some of these on a real model of a heart, or an anatomically correct model of a heart. But I think it's useful for starting to think about where these chambers are in relation to each other, and then also how they hook up with specific blood vessels. So when we have the KITE diagram, KITE is another kind of fancy way of saying a disproportionate diamond. So it's kind of like kites that you fly, it's a shape. And so if we split it into 4 chambers, remember we're thinking about, again, anatomical positioning. So our right is this image is left. The chambers on the top are the atria. So we have the left atrium and the right atrium. The chambers on the bottom are the ventricles, the left ventricle and the right ventricle. And those ventricles have a lot of muscle to them. So they're very important for pumping. That's where blood that leaves the heart is going to exit from the ventricles. Blood just kind of passively flows into the atria to some extent. We have valves that separate the atria from the ventricles on each side of the heart, but they allow blood to flow through. So the left side of your heart is oxygenated, the right side of your heart is deoxygenated. Blood is going to flow passively from the left atrium to the left ventricle and from the right atrium to the right ventricle, but it's not going to go from right to left or vice versa. The aorta connects to the left ventricle. The vena cava connects to the right atrium, the pulmonary artery connects to the right ventricle, and the pulmonary vein connects to the left atrium. The order in which I said those matters, but that will make a little bit more sense once we talk more about the flow of blood throughout the body. So to transition from the KITE diagram to an anatomically correct heart, we can see this image, and we see that all of those vessels that I kind of separated out before actually emerge or connect to the top or superior portion of the heart. So when you look at a real heart or an anatomical model, you'll see that we don't have vessels sticking out the bottom of the heart. Everything kind of gets flipped around and is looping out of the top. That makes it a little bit confusing. Here they also kind of thickened the ventricles, so you can see that they are where a lot of the muscle is, and that's where the pumping is happening. This image is not perfect though, because the left ventricle actually has way more muscle than the right. So we can see that here. The left ventricle has to have a lot more muscle because it's pumping blood from your heart to the rest of your body. So it has to go all over, whereas the right ventricle is part of the pulmonary circuit. It just has to pump very briefly to get blood from your heart to your lungs to be reoxygenated. I mentioned those valves already, but I also wanted to point out there's a couple different names for them. So on the right side of your heart, separating the right atrium from the right ventricle, we have the tricuspid valve. That's what I usually call it, but it's also called the right atrioventricular valve. That word sounds very long and confusing. It just means separating the atrium and the ventricle. On the left side, we have the left atrioventricular valve, which is called the bicuspid valve, and it's also actually called the mitral valve. So this looks very similar to the model that you'll see in lab. Okay, so in terms of those layers of the heart and kind of the thickness of the muscle, moving from the interior of the heart to the exterior, we have the endocardium, endo meaning inside, card meaning heart, and ium is kind of like a tissue layer. So endocardium is that layer on the inside of your heart. Sometimes people get different types of bacterial infections and get what's called endocarditis, which is swelling of that layer, which can be very dangerous. The bulk of the heart is this myocardium. So myo means muscle, card is heart, and ium is layer. So this is the muscle layer of your heart, which is the bulk of the heart. Then we have the epicardium, which is towards the outside, the pericardium, which is the sac that completely surrounds the heart and protects it from the surrounding organs and bones. Okay, so those were the different chambers and structures of the heart, but the other component of this is the vascular component, and that's referring to blood vessels. And so remember that we have the heart that's pumping, it's connected to those vessels where the blood is actually contained. So there's a few different types of blood vessels. There are arteries, veins, and capillaries. And you've probably heard of all of these, but you might have some misconceptions about them. Most people think about arteries as being oxygenated, but really the main distinction between arteries and veins is not oxygenation or deoxygenation, it's how they carry blood in relation to the heart. So arteries carry very high pressure blood that's being pumped away from the heart, so you can think about artery away. Veins are under very low pressure because they're carrying blood back to the heart from different parts of the body. We don't have hearts in our feet. We don't have another way of increasing that pressure. So they're under very low pressure, and there's structural differences associated with that functional difference. In between arteries and veins, we have capillaries, which are where exchange actually takes place between tissues and blood. And there's a very high surface area to volume ratio there. So when we think about the differences that exist because of those functional differences, we can see that regardless of the overall diameter of the artery or vein of the vessel, the wall of the artery is always going to be thicker. It's always going to have more smooth muscle. It's going to be more reinforced because it's under high pressure as to withstand that pressure, and it also has to keep that pressure going to keep blood flowing throughout the body. So when we look at a cross-section of the histology, we can see that arteries remain kind of circular, veins are very floppy because they're not as reinforced with that smooth muscle. So going between those, we have really big arteries that are connected to the heart, specifically the pulmonary artery and the aorta. But as they move away from the heart, they branch out and they get smaller and smaller, going from artery to arteriole. And then into capillaries. As gas exchange happens, that blood continues to flow. It's now carrying more waste products and carbon dioxide, and it's entering into venules, which have a high surface area to volume ratio, are not quite as big as veins, but bigger than capillaries. Those venules eventually drain into proper veins, which return to the heart. The veins that connect to the heart are the vena cava and the pulmonary vein. So when we look at arteries and arterioles, it might be tempting to just say that arterioles are just tiny arteries. That's not true. Even though they have the same basic layers, they have differences in cellular appearance and kind of in what's embedded in those different layers. So arteries and arterioles are slightly different in structure. They're not exactly the same. The difference is not just size. For veins, remember they're under very low pressure, but they still have to have a way of getting blood back to the heart. So our veins are very dependent on our skeletal muscle to kind of, when we're like standing and we have these constant skeletal muscle movements to keep us upright, those skeletal muscles are pushing on veins and returning blood back to our heart. That blood does not flow backwards and lose progress because we also have unidirectional or one-way valves that prevent backflow of blood. So when you stand on your head or do like a handstand or something like that, blood is not actually going backwards. It's always moving in a consistent direction. This idea is also why soldiers that are standing at attention and lock their knees have a tendency to faint, because their skeletal muscle is not able to move blood back from different extremities to their heart, and they lose oxygen and they build up carbon dioxide. So the exchange is actually happening at capillaries. You have capillary beds throughout your body, and there's a capillary within at least a cell diameter or two of every single cell. Flow through blood through those capillaries is called microcirculation, and this again speaks to the importance of surface area. One thing that's kind of cool is that there are capillaries that feed really big arteries and veins, so they're called vasa vasorum. So those are small blood vessels that feed that thick, smooth muscle tissue in different layers of bigger arteries and veins. So this slide has a lot of information. You don't need to memorize the numbers, but I do want you to kind of pay close attention to the structure of those capillaries. You can see that they're only about the diameter of a single red blood cell or two. So you're really maximizing the area for gas exchange and exchange of nutrients between blood and red blood cells and the surrounding tissue. So it really creates a tight 1-to-1 ratio of surface area on the capillary to surface area on the red blood cells, and really allows for exchange with the surrounding body tissue. Okay, so we have the heart component of cardio, we have the vascular component, the vessels, and we're going to put all of that together and look at the whole cardiovascular system. So I'm going to verbally walk my way through this diagram because I think it's a kind of cool way to bring together a lot of different ideas that we've talked about. I'll start with the left ventricle and then move out through the aorta. So here we have the left ventricle. In this diagram, oxygenated blood is red, deoxygenated is blue, and you'll see that the left ventricle is, again, very muscly. So that left ventricle is going to pump, and it's going to send rich oxygenated blood out through the aorta. That's going to be under high pressure and is going to travel throughout the body, and then gas exchange is going to take place in the systemic circuit. So those arteries are going to transition into arterioles, which will transition into capillaries. Exchange will take place. Oxygen will go from blood to body tissue, carbon dioxide from body tissue to blood, and then deoxygenated blood will make its way back through those systemic venules and veins under low pressure to the right atrium. It's going to drain into the right atrium through the vena cava. There's actually two of them, a superior and inferior one, depending on where it's draining from. It's going to drain into the right ventricle, which will then pump again briefly and go out through the pulmonary arteries. So there, pulmonary tells you it's going to the lungs, arteries tells you it's going away from the heart. Gas exchange will happen in reverse in the lungs. The blood will give off carbon dioxide and take on oxygen, and then it will flow back under low pressure through the pulmonary veins, which are oxygenated, into the left atrium, and the cycle will start again. So I wanted to kind of diagram this with the KITE diagram just to build it up a little bit. It's going to be messy on my computer, but I have a slide on the next slide, which is how it looks when I draw it on the whiteboard, and my handwriting is a little bit nicer in person than it is on my laptop since I don't have a stylus. So when we have this KITE diagram, we have the 4 different chambers. So remember, we have this left ventricle here. We have the left atrium. We have the right atrium and the right ventricle. And I'm just gonna open those. Oh no, it erased the whole thing. Okay, let's fix that. I thought that maybe it would just erase part of it. Oh well. Okay, so there's gonna be openings here. So just imagine those are open and openings here. All right, so nice oxygen-rich blood is going to start out in the left ventricle, which is very muscly. It's going to get pumped and it's going to flow out through the aorta. Which will get smaller and smaller and branch off into different arteries of the systemic circuit. So it's going to keep flowing. Gas exchange is going to take place at the capillaries throughout the body. So oxygen will go into the body tissue. CO2 will go into the blood. And then we have deoxygenated blood making its way from the body back to the heart. So the tricky thing here is that it's going to drain, remember, into the atrium. Blood is draining into the atria, enters atria, and exits the heart through the ventricles. So we have the vena cava draining into the right atrium. This is very messy. I need to buy a stylus. And then we have it draining from the right atrium into the right ventricle. It's going to get pumped out through the pulmonary arteries and do another little loop-de-loop behind here. I'm going to draw it in a dark blue color so that you can see it and it doesn't overlap with this black line. And we have the lungs up here. So this is the pulmonary circuit. So that blood is deoxygenated, it's flowing, and it's going out through the pulmonary arteries. Gas exchange is going to take place in capillaries surrounding the alveoli, and so we're going to have oxygen now going from the lungs into the blood, and CO2 is going from the blood into the lungs so that we can breathe it out. So now the partial pressure of oxygen is higher, the partial pressure of CO2 is lower, and so we call oxygenated blood is going to go into that left atrium through the pulmonary veins. So a couple things to kind of summarize this. The right side of your heart is deoxygenated, the left side is oxygenated. In the systemic circuit, arteries are carrying oxygenated blood and veins are carrying deoxygenated blood. In the pulmonary circuit, it's reversed. Arteries are carrying deoxygenated blood and veins are carrying oxygenated blood. Blood is just kind of passively flowing in through the atria and being actively pumped out through those ventricles. Keep that in mind. Okay, so this is the much better image that we have when I do this in person. So you can definitely take your time looking at this and studying it and have it be less messy. Okay, so when we're thinking about how we measure this work, we're measuring what's called cardiac output. And so this is a function of two things. Our heart rate, which is how frequently our heart is pumping. We kind of have an intuitive knowledge of this. All of us have had our heart rate measured at some point, as well as our stroke volume, which is how efficiently our heart is pumping. We have less of an intuitive knowledge about this. So a lot of us have experience with our heart rate kind of changing. If you're nervous, if you have to give a speech in front of the class, if you've just been doing a lot of cardio activity and running, if you take certain medication, that changes your heart rate. And so it's pretty flexible. Stroke volume is more physiological. It's based on biological sex, your fitness, your heart size. And so those kind of work and both contribute to cardiac output. So just like how you can go to the gym and deadlift, and the next time you deadlift, you'll be able to lift more. When you go to the gym and do cardiac exercise, so like running, you are increasing the efficiency of your heart muscle. So your heart rate can decrease relative to that and still have the same cardiac output. So that's why people who do a lot of cardiac activity, a lot of people who are athletes or runners, have a very low heart rate because they have very efficient heart muscle and higher stroke volume. That's also why sometimes marathon runners die in their sleep, because your heart rate decreases when you're sleeping and then it gets dangerously low. That is not a reason to not run. All of us should probably be doing a little bit more cardiac activity. So in terms of blood pressure, what that actually is we mentioned different vessels are under different degrees of pressure. Specifically, your arteries are under a lot more pressure. So that blood flowing through your vessels exerts pressure on those vessels, helps to push blood throughout the body in addition to that smooth muscle, and that's blood pressure. So blood pressure is important. If it gets too low, that can be very dangerous. Oftentimes, though, we think about it getting too high. And the way that we measure that is through our blood pressure during systole and during diastole. So your systolic pressure is that top number. It's the pressure that's exerted on your blood vessels while the heart is beating. It's usually around 120 in healthy adults. And then in diastole, that's between heartbeats. So diastolic blood pressure is the pressure exerted between heartbeats. It's usually around 80. So 120 over 80 is kind of the higher range of normal. It is often lower than that, but then there's elevated ranges, high blood pressure, and hypertensive ranges as well. This video is really cool. It's narrated by a guy named Wilfred Manzano. I recommend watching it on your own time. It's not anything that you need to know for this class, but it is really cool, especially if you are going on to have a pre-health career. All right, so this case study is pretty useful because I think a lot of us have personal relationships or even just social awareness of heart attacks, but many people don't know what they actually are. Heart attacks are also called myocardial infarctions. And so keep in mind, again, that the heart is a muscle, and muscles require a huge amount of oxygen in order to power mitochondria and generate ATP through cellular respiration. And so the heart needs its own supply of blood as well. So think about like a truck carrying gasoline or oil. Even though an oil tanker might have a supply of oil inside of it, it still needs its own supply of gas and oil to run the actual truck. And so the heart can't just use the blood that's flowing through it. It has to have vessels that take blood to it and remove take oxygen to it and remove carbon dioxide. And so if you block the arteries, the coronary arteries that supply the heart with blood, then you can result in cell death and a disruption of function that is called a heart attack. So specifically, there's one vessel called the left anterior descending artery, the LAD. It's also called the widowmaker because it is really prone to causing very serious heart attacks. So I'm going to allow you guys to work through this on your own time. There's questions about this as well as an answer key, but it's not something that you specifically need to know for this class. It's just kind of useful information. It can be summarized with this idea that if you damage the left ventricle, because that is the most muscly, doing the most work in pumping, that will have the greatest effect on the heart. Damage to the atria doesn't really interfere with heart function very much. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information. We covered 2 chapters. Again, feel free to break these lecture videos up into kind of smaller pieces. Watch maybe 15 minutes at a time. Pause it, rewatch parts as often as you need to. But really watching the video is the same as going to class, and that's something that you need to do. Online classes are not easier than in-person classes. They're just more flexible, so they allow people with different schedules to accommodate different demands. You still have to do the work of watching the videos and learning the information. Okay, so make sure that you are going back and reviewing the quiz feedback every week after midnight on Wednesday. Make sure that you're watching these videos, checking the study guides for the quizzes. Work through those study guides and have them out with you when you take the quizzes. You're not going to have them out when you take the final exam, so you really need to make sure that you're on track and getting the information down every week so that you're prepared for the final. Make sure you do the online reflection on Monday by midnight and complete the upcoming quiz. If you are struggling with the reflections and the quizzes or to keep track of the assignments, these slides are very helpful. Everything's always due on the same day, but don't hesitate to reach out for me if you have any questions or concerns.